At 10:11 on the morning of the 24th of November 1974, Bridgeport police were sent to a modest house on Lindley Street after a report of strange activity. What officers found inside was not an ordinary domestic disturbance. Officer Joseph Tomek and Officer Carl Leonzi entered the house and described what they saw in their report. Furniture, pictures, religious articles, and personal belongings had been thrown around the rooms. The Gooden family was still inside, frightened and asking for help. The people living there were Gerard and Laura Gooden and their adopted daughter, Marcia. To the outside world, they were an ordinary family, but according to Gerard, the disturbances had already begun the previous evening. Gerard told police that the banging began around 9 o'clock that Friday night. It seemed to come from the walls and outside the house. There was no obvious source, but the family could not simply ignore it. The following afternoon, Gerard returned home and found a portable television that had been sitting on a shelf in Marcia's room, lying on her bed. He put it back. According to his report, what happened next was far more disturbing. Gerard told officers that after the television was returned to its shelf, dishes began rising from the kitchen sink and flying around the room. It was no longer just unexplained noise. Now, objects themselves were moving. By the time police arrived, the disturbances had left visible damage throughout the house. Pictures were broken, furniture had been overturned, religious objects had fallen from the walls. Sergeant Bernard Mangiamele arrived and entered the house himself. His report described the same chaotic scene, but according to his account, he would witness something that was much harder to explain. Mangiamele also reported another strange incident involving Marcia. She was sitting in a reclining chair when it suddenly moved into the reclining position. The adults had difficulty reproducing the movement themselves. The reports were no longer coming from one frightened family. Different officers were recording different incidents inside the same house. The question changed from what was happening to whether anyone could explain it. Then came one of the most extraordinary accounts in the entire case. A patrolman entered the kitchen and later reported seeing the refrigerator lift approximately 6 to 8 inches from the floor before moving several feet toward him. The officer's report did not describe a shadow or apparition causing the movement. He described the refrigerator itself. For an officer, there was nothing visible to arrest, confront, or explain. Other officers reported disturbances of their own. One described seeing a picture fall from the wall, a small desk move, and a kitchen clock drop from its shelf. He immediately left the house and waited outside. For the Goodens, the police presence did not end the fear. A patrolman who lived directly across the street later reported finding the family outside their home, screaming for help and saying an evil force was wrecking the house. What began as a frightening family emergency was now becoming something larger. Firefighters were arriving. Neighbors gathered outside. The small house was becoming the center of an event that nobody seemed able to control. Inside, the investigators tried to make sense of what they were seeing. There was no obvious intruder, no broken window explaining the disorder, and no visible person moving the objects. Yet the reports continued to accumulate. Outside, curiosity was turning into a spectacle. People who had heard rumors began arriving at Lindley Street. Some came looking for an explanation. Others simply wanted to see whether the strange stories were true. The story was no longer confined to police reports. Reporters arrived with cameras and notebooks, and the strange events began entering newspapers. Lindley Street was becoming a public story. As the story spread, clergy also became involved. Policemen mentioned priests and other visitors arriving at the house. The response was changing rapidly. This was no longer simply a question for the family or the police. Then, two of the most recognizable figures in American paranormal history became involved. Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived at the Gooden home. Their presence would push the story further into the world of paranormal investigation. By now, Lindley Street was no longer just a local police call. Newspapers were following the story, and the small Bridgeport house had become the center of one of Connecticut's strangest public spectacles. As investigators searched for an explanation, attention increasingly focused on Marcia. She was only 10 years old, yet many accounts placed her close to the center of the disturbances. The more investigators considered the possibility of human involvement, the more complicated the case became. If objects were genuinely moving, someone might be responsible. But how could the many reported incidents be explained? On November 26th, newspapers reported that police believed the haunting was a hoax. The story suddenly appeared to have an explanation. The supernatural activity was being staged. But the announcement didn't make the reports disappear. The hoax explanation answered one question, but created another. Police officers had already written reports describing objects moving inside the house. Their reports remained and could not simply be erased. From this point forward, Lindley Street had two competing stories. One said the events were a hoax created inside the house. The other argued that witnesses had seen things they could not explain. Some witnesses accepted the hoax explanation. Others remained convinced they had personally witnessed unexplained activity. After 1974, the story became harder to separate what was witnessed from what was reported. What can we establish with confidence? The Gooden family reported disturbing activity. Police responded. Multiple officers documented unusual conditions. Beyond those facts, certainty becomes much harder. That leaves the central mystery. If it was entirely a hoax, what explains the reports made by officers who claimed to witness objects moving? And if something genuinely happened, how much was later distorted by fear and publicity? The Bridgeport Poltergeist was officially called a hoax, but the record is more complicated. The real mystery may be not whether ghosts existed, but what actually happened inside 966 Lindley Street.